morning, everyone. I apologize in advance if people are still going to join this meeting, but in the interest of time, we're going to kick off immediately and not do the traditional 5-minute thing. Colleagues, it gives me great pleasure this morning to welcome somebody that, I was just saying to Chris, everybody knows him. I find it a bit a futile exercise to do a introduction as we normally do when we have a webinar, but we're very, very excited to be joined by Chris Geers this morning. Everybody knows you, Chris, and thank you for giving up your time and being with us this morning. But just by way of introduction for those that maybe don't know you, Chris is the MD of a company called BMIT. I think if you don't know Chris, you certainly do know BMIT. They're a research and advisory company that have been working for 30 years in the ICT sector. And they produce commercial reports ranging from fiber to 5G, cybersecurity, cloud, etc. And I'm sure if there's any other topic that I haven't touched on, you guys would be keen to consider that. Chris is by trade he's a electrical engineer. And he's also got an executive MBA, which he passed cum laude. He's been in the sector for many years, and his experience ranged from starting one of South Africa's, and many people probably don't know that, but starting one of South Africa's first ISPs back in 1996, to presiding directly over the launch of MTN's early data services through to 3G. You also had a short or a while at Huawei, where you worked on the business case for Telkom's NGN core upgrade and initial 3G rollout. And also you worked with other operators on their initial 3G deployments across Southern Africa. Chris, and then you actually spent 3 years in the Eastern Cape doing community volunteer work, where you lived without running water, electricity, and communication. Yeah, so that's fantastic, and you say in your bio that that's something that fueled your passion for the digital divide. And I must say, when we sit in the cities and we talk about the digital divide, I always think, no, we can do this, and then when I move into the rural communities, I go like, oh my word, how are we going to do this? So yeah, it's like a mammoth task still ahead of us, but welcome, Chris. I'm really excited to have you here. I'm going to ask you to just spend like a second to just do an intro on BMIT, and just tell us a bit more about the company, and then, yeah, very interesting topic this morning. Really excited to learn a little bit more about where we at, where the rest of the world is at, potential roads to getting there. Can we get there? Are we going to skip 5G, go to 6G? Are we going to try and hammer at this thing? But yeah, very exciting. Colleagues, please introduce yourself in the chat. And yeah, this is also an opportunity to do some online networking. So you're welcome to drop your contact details in the chat and just tell us a little bit about who you are. And but yeah, Chris, otherwise I'm going to hand over to you. And yeah, good luck. I'll catch up at the end.
Thanks very much, Juanita, and thanks very much for the opportunity. And I really appreciate the attendance, those who've joined us. I hope we can make this hour and a half worthwhile. So I guess the presentation's up on the screen. As Juanita said, I'm going to present on South Africa versus the world. It's been the decade of 5G, starting in 2020. 2030 will be 6G, start being introduced, and reaching the halfway mark very quickly at 2025, so it's a good time to take stock before operators start deploying 5G advanced next year, and to see where we stand and how whatever we're experiencing stacks up with what other people have done or experiencing. So 5G, South Africa versus the world, as Juanita said, from BMIT. So that's a company which is pretty much the pioneer of ICT market research in South Africa from nearly 35 years ago. We've done over 2,000, nearly 2,600 projects now, maybe even more. And Brian, who's my colleague, is also on the call if we have any questions that need in-depth answers on the broadband side, who's actually one of the founder members, one of the founder directors as well. And really what BMIT does is help those in the industry who need to make important business decisions. And we do that through market research and assistance analysis of various aspects of the market. So in order to do that, one of our lines of activity is producing reports that Juanita mentioned. We have quite a few, so they range from the telco, direct broadband and wholesale, through to various verticals, government, finance, etc., specialist topics like MVNO, IoT, and also on the IT side, general view on the IT services and looking at cybersecurity, cloud, other components of IT. And those are used by salespeople, by managers, by investors to make those important decisions or plans in the market. So before I start looking at where we are today, I thought I'd step back and look at some of the history of 5G because it has a strong bearing on what's going on today. So the road that got us here, looking at what the original design objective was, the spectrum issues arising from 5G initially, how ready the world was, some of the early developments, etc., and that will segue into the actual topic. So just to go back on the triangle on the left, the pyramid, this is what the ITU, the International Telecommunications Unit, their radio division, decided in 2015 that 2G and 3G, the 3GPP mobile market was going in a particular direction, but by 2020 there might be specific requirements. And they divided these into what's on the apex, the three corners of the triangle. On the top, the enhanced mobile broadband, faster, more reliable, low latency, etc., for certain applications. On the bottom left, you'll see machine type communications on a massive scale. They were expecting much more widespread deployment of sensors and controllers. And then on the right-hand side, what 5G is often known for in terms of marketing, ultra-reliable, low-latency communications. So sort of millisecond level with high levels of reliability. And those were mapped onto the circle on the right, the sort of spider diagram of all the performance parameters of what 5G would need to do in order to qualify as 5G. And each of the corner scenarios on the left side, the usage scenarios, is mapped onto a different color of what that would mean in terms of the requirements on the left side. So you have the blue, the yellow, and the green. So that's really what 5G was aiming to do and the reason why in terms of how they understood the market. And they did say it should provide a user experience which matched as far as possible what fixed networks could offer. So one of the key features of 5G, which was partly to enable those scenarios, was additional spectrum. And at the time it became popular, let's say in 2019, to look at 3 bands of spectrum. Officially, there are only 2, frequency range 1 and 2 that are defined, but in sort of popular discussion, we look at the 3. So the Ericsson diagram shows how the bands translate into 3 important aspects: coverage, capacity, broadband or data capacity, and latency. Now, if we look at the low band, number 1, which is sub-gigahertz spectrum, that's what the original GSM used to be, a 900, and also 700 and 800, that was being, at the time, released up from the digital migration global of TV, called the digital dividend, was going to make available 700 and 800. And then in some countries, the 600, which was used for UHF TV broadcasting, and they felt they were going to need less of it going forward because people are moving away from linear TV. So that's where the sub gigahertz spectrum sat, and the idea was that you could cover the countries quite quickly with that spectrum because it has further penetration, can go into buildings, and you need fewer base stations. In reality, as we know, much of this spectrum was actually offered too late to become sort of the first rollout, but certainly contributed to, and also to better performance inside buildings. So the second category is the mid bands, and that sort of forms a compromise between coverage and the high performance. And that was sitting in the 1 gigahertz right up to, say, 24 gigahertz, but a lot of it around 3.5 gigahertz. That was going to be mid-band. And in fact, what's happened is that that's one of my themes. Most of the deployments are actually in that mid 3.5 gigahertz band, as it turns out, what's often called the C band. So that mid band has become actually critical to the whole narrative, being a compromise between coverage and capacity. And then you have the high bands, and this is what there was a lot of talk because it was a new spectrum range that hadn't been used for mobile before. The IMT, which is the generic name for LTE and 5G. The IMT community went to the World Radio Congress in 2019, which is where they all meet around the world, the decision makers, and decide what spectrum is used for what. And they looked for additional spectrum in these high bands so that they could then proceed on a global basis to offer basically the higher capacity and the lower latency, which is needed for those features that I mentioned: ultra reliable, low latency performance. Now, the problem with the spectrum is it has short range propagation, doesn't go very far, and it's line of sight. So ahead of this, ahead of launches, many countries identified what they call the pioneer band, because they needed to have at least one band of spectrum available in this high band to allow their operators in their country to launch. Now, we all remember the story at the time, or if you don't, this is the introduction. With the high band, and there was so much media press about this in 2019, 2020, with the high bands, as this Cyrodiil calculation shows, you need 16 times more sites, even just to cover 95% of what you can do with 3.5 gig spectrum for 26. So instead of needing, say, 7 sites in a suburb, you'd need 109. And that's why everyone was suddenly talking about densification, the need for a lot of fiber backhaul, all these sites that are going to go up on every street. They were talking about a cell every 150 meters. There were pilots in America, for example, in Sacramento, where they actually went live with some suburbs, and they were talking about covering 27 houses per site only. So quite a lot of small cells needed. And that explains why there was sort of a shift away from this. Operators said, let's rather go with the 3.5 gigahertz to get going, rather than have all these dense sites. And that also explains why tower sharing became much more topical on the 5G than it had been. Once the launches went ahead, you'll see in the red or purple color on the right in the beginning, at Feb 2019, there were many operators investing in some way in 5G. So either testing it or providing limited coverage, live tests, sometimes with a limited number of customers, or starting to actually announce commercial deployments in certain areas. So you see the whole world's covered in red, except, of course, conspicuously, most of Africa wasn't. We only got onto the map because RAIN was close to launching in 2019. Well, they did launch by the end of 2019. So there were only actually 3 countries in Africa, and that's also one of my sort of comparative points, that Africa has been well behind actually the rest of the world. So I won't give you the statistics on this page, but you can get the idea of how many launches were being planned or tried. Massive MIMO, which is when you have 64 mini antenna built into each antenna, was very common amongst many of them. Some of them were trying what was called network slicing, which was where you offer different dimensions of that triangle that I showed you, the pyramid, to different customers on a service level agreement basis. That didn't really take off the way that it had been expected. As we know now, you can't go and get a service level agreement easily from operators, but they were certainly trialing it. That was one of the sort of high profile features that was going to be offered. And already by 2019, the most popular bands were between 3.4 and 3.8 gigahertz. Now I'm just going to look at some aspects of 5G. So on the input side, the spectrum available, the devices, the operator investments, and government policy, and compare those, and then we'll look at some of the outputs. So on the spectrum side, just to summarize, just so you've got an overall picture, there was that 3-band premise that I meant, high, medium, and low. And that meant that regulators knew that they had to offer at least 3 categories of spectrum assignment in order to allow operators to have the low band for the coverage, the high band for performance, and the medium band for the general combined benefit. And so many countries actually did provide what they called those 3 pioneer bands to make sure that deployment could start. South Africa actually delayed in all 3 of the categories. So there was no sub-gigahertz, there was no mid-band, that was only actually provided in 2022, and there was no high band available. So we definitely started off on the wrong foot from a regulatory point of view. And the operators that have made progress did it through various sort of non-systematic mechanisms, if I could put it like that. So the mid-band spectrum did have a lot of momentum around the world with those launches, and that started to make the spectrum around that much more attractive than people had realized. And that's carrying through to today in terms of the way people are planning. They've sort of redirected focus towards the mid-band spectrum. And you'll see that even in South Africa now, much of it has been, especially the 3.5 itself, has been auctioned, and there are other RF SAPs. So when I say RF SAP in the document, you'll see in the presentation, those are the radio frequency plans that are very specific to each band. And in order for an operator to use spectrum, there needs to be an RF SAP promulgated by ICASA for that spectrum band. And so there are now quite a few RF SAPs ready for the next round of auction, especially in the mid-band, various spectrum within the mid-band. Not necessarily the most popular parts of the mid-band, but filling in the gaps, because over time people have said 5G is more efficient. It is the way to go in future, at least for now. So let's take spectrum that's not being used properly or efficiently, and let's apply to have it used for IMT use, where it can be much more effectively used because of the rising demand for data. So there are quite a few bands. I haven't really covered them now. I can talk about them if asked, like in the 2 gigabits range, 2.1, which was the old 3G, 2.3, which is used for LTE in South Africa at the moment, mainly 2.6, which is also used for LTE and which was also part of the last auction in 2022. So there is quite a lot of spectrum in the mid-band, but for this, to simplify this, I've focused on the 3500. And then on the low-band spectrum, much of that 700 and 800 megahertz spectrum, as I said, became available from the digital dividend and was included, already available and included in many of the operator launches. It was also used for LTE because many countries had problems with congestion and lack of spectrum with LTE. And that's really why the South African operators in 2022, well, for the last 14 years before that, were so eager to get their hands on it to deal with the congestion on the LTE bands. And it's also available for 5G. So the 600 megahertz is spectrum, as I said earlier, that was used for broadcasting, and I'll also touch on that and where that stands in a future slide. And then you have this high band spectrum, 26 and 28, where there's been all that flurry of preparation and activity in the early years, but much less interest right now. So, the interest has waned. There were bands identified in the WRC 19 and also by individual countries, but I'll touch on that later. And I've shown the three quite common 24, 26, and 28 gigahertz bands that relates to. So this is a very important slide if you just want to understand at the crux of where we are at the moment with 5G. So what I've done is I've looked at I mentioned a few times that the 3500 spectrum is so popular. And because of its popularity, there's been more focus on seeing sort of the full picture of what can be made available because of operators already providing service at, let's say, 3500 megahertz. Would it be possible to go down to 3300 or go up to 38 or even 4200 so that you can use the same towers, you can expand your equipment easily, so you're basically in the right ballpark. And this would mean a maturing and an expanding of the ecosystem around the 3500 spectrum. And that has been a development that wasn't nearly as adequately anticipated in the beginning. The other thing I might add is when you look at LTE, spectrum can be given in 20 megahertz blocks because that's how much each sort of antenna handles as a block of spectrum when it's providing service. You can, with LTE, stack up those blocks. So if you're given 5, 6, up to 6 chunks of spectrum in different ranges, LTE can combine them all to give far higher capacity, higher speed service. It's fairly complex, but it can be done, and it's part of the standards. So that's why with LTE you can give over a gigabit download in theory, and you can do it under test situations if you have all that spectrum. South Africa operators don't have that spectrum, so they wouldn't be able to do in the same way in South Africa what they could have done, for example, in Australia, where operators could actually demonstrate in the field a gigabit download on LTE. And that was using the 20 megahertz blocks. So 5G came out, the new radio specifications, which are part of, they're called New Radio, created a block size of 100 megahertz, because everyone was, since the early days, using much more data, and it seemed more appropriate and simpler to give out blocks of up to 100 megahertz. Then on the high bands, the 26 gigahertz that I mentioned, they actually can give up 400 megahertz blocks. So you can give an operator 400 megahertz block, and they can use it all with one radio antenna and give high-speed service. So going back to this 3500, you can see that altogether between 3300, let's say, and 36, which is what South Africa is concerned with at the moment, there's only 300 megahertz altogether between 3300 and 38. There's only 500 megahertz altogether. So you could only really give 100 to each of the main sort of players. And remember, this isn't fully finalized. So what's been given out at the moment, what's been assigned to operators is the 34 to 36. So the operators at the moment in South Africa are all sharing the 200. So there's no ways they can do a 100 megahertz block at the moment unless they share spectrum and work together. So that's why there's another reason for the interest in expanding this block, because then you can give each operator a bigger single block of spectrum that they can use, which is much more practical. I don't know if that makes sense. That's a little bit technical. So there are two reasons. There's more capacity and make better use of the 5G speed benefit. Now, looking at the middle, let's start with 3400. This is very commonly allocated globally to IMT, and in South Africa, this was auctioned and assigned and now assigned in 2022. So that's anyone who's using 5G at the moment is likely to use the spectrum. The 36 to 38 is an interesting band. Much of this spectrum used to be used by satellites. This was the common band that you would see. You still see some of the larger dishes. Let's say at embassies, etc., use these bigger dishes. They were using that's why it was called C-band. It was a satellite band. So what's happened now with the 36 to 38, as I've got on the left globally, at the latest World Radio Congress, which is when all the global regulators and decision makers and lobbyists get together, that was in November. That's just happened a few months ago, 2023. It happens every 4 years. And at that World Radio Congress 23, they identified this spectrum for IMT, in other words, 4G, 5G. But it was identified in Africa and the Middle East, not actually the European Union. Now, I mentioned these three because we all sit in what's called Region 1. So within the world spectrum, we sort of try and harmonize with Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, whereas Asia Pacific has a different region, and then, North America, South America in one region, then Asia Pacific's in another. So you have the world sort of divided into 3 regions. We're sitting in Region 1, and that's why I make mention. And that's why I talk about the European Union, because we make decisions sort of together with other African countries as well as them. So they didn't identify this extra 200 band for IMT as for primary. In other words, they said you can use it, but it's primary use. They have noticed there's still satellites. There's still satellites using some of it, and some of it still, but some of them have been cleared to the upper bands. A lot of money has changed hands with the satellite operators to get them to move up, especially from the US operator, to get them to move up to the higher bands. Now, this is a very interesting, and why I'm laboring this one a little bit. This is a very interesting band because in South Africa, it's not actually on the IMT roadmap. So whereas in many other countries and with this World Radio Congress, it's going ahead. If you look at our documents in South Africa, it's not actually on the roadmap. And yet it is used for 5G. Now, how is it used for 5G? Well, RAIN was assigned 60 megahertz in this band, actually in the 35 to 37, as far back as 2018. That allowed them to launch in 2019. Even they had to take second place to satellites, but they've engaged with customers and made a plan with them. And they were only allowed to do fixed wireless services, to provide fixed wireless access services under that license, because it wasn't actually IMT. It was just spectrum that was used for data broadcasts. And now COMSOL, and there are others as well, but COMSOL specifically is more active. In 2022 was able to access 60 megahertz of that spectrum as well. So that's actually changed the market dynamic, because you have all the mobile operators going to auctions, spending billions on getting IMT spectrum, etc. And then you also have these two players, RAIN, which is quite significant now, and COMSOL, getting spectrum outside the IMT band. So if we had to compare with the rest of the world, that's I would say, somewhat of an anomaly. This lower band has actually been prepared as an RF SAP in South Africa, so it's ready to be auctioned. And it has become popular in Africa, and it was adopted in Region 2 as well. Now, the reason why that's significant is because if you have more than one region adopting the same spectrum, you have a much bigger ecosystem, and prices come down on the equipment, etc. And you can share notes, share expertise, R&D, etc. So that's where we're sitting with this very important 3500 band, with the main sort of interest being around this, the way that RAIN and COMSOL have accessed this spectrum and what they're allowed to do with it. Another interesting aspect, which has just been published now from ICASA, is that they plan to issue regulations now. They've had their hearings with the public, they've got feedback, and they've made a decision that they're going to provide regulation to offer a sharing sandbox. In other words, sandbox meaning that it won't go fully live, it will be under controlled conditions, to make this spectrum here, the 38 to 4200, available for sharing by, for example, industry players and maybe communities as well, who want to access spectrum to provide services to themselves, especially in areas where they're underserviced. So that's a very interesting development that we'll want to watch. If you look globally, that portion, well, part of it, the 38 to 4, went for $81 billion in the United States. I think it gave everyone in the world a bit of a shock, that huge amount. And that's why there's suddenly a lot more interest in this spectrum as well, because they could see how important it is to operators. They also had to spend another $9 billion helping the satellite operators to move out of their spectrum. Japan has actually also awarded to some mobile operators, and a few countries in Europe actually make this available to verticals, for industry directly, not having realized the value that could be maybe. So it could be gained from it. So I think watch the space with this spectrum as well, both in South Africa specifically and in world developments. The 600 I've also highlighted, and that's interesting because this is lower than the other spectrum, like 700, 800, and therefore you can expect it to propagate further. And if you were coming to a new country from scratch and wanted to deploy 5G, probably the best way to do it would be to use this 600 spectrum, what used to be called the UHF band in TV terms. And then you could cover the country with the fewest base stations. And in the US, that was actually done quite effectively back in 2019. One of the operators was able to expand actually they used it for LTE as well, to expand their coverage quite a lot. There's always been a clash with the broadcasters, because the TV broadcasters say they still want to use it. They don't want to give it up because they'll never get it back. And they say, no, we can use it for TV broadcast. So what happened in America, there was a reverse option. So the mobile operators actually paid the broadcasters for it. And unsurprisingly, the broadcasters were happy to give it up if they were given cash for it. And so it was called a reverse auction. And they also expedited the transfer, because the broadcasters only got their cash once they cleared the spectrum. So that was some of the background to this TV linked spectrum, the IMT 600. Now we thought, some of us, that because there is some spectrum available in South Africa, because now the digital migration is almost complete, and because there's not as much linear, old-fashioned, let's say, or legacy broadcasting happening as there used to be, there might be spectrum available for IMT, for 5G, as has been demonstrated in other countries. I've got the examples on the left of countries which have looked at it or even assigned it. Canada and the US being red, showing the obvious ones, and then Puerto Rico, but also other countries considering it, like Australia, New Zealand, and planning to go ahead, like Mexico, Guatemala. So there's definitely an ecosystem there of 5G. And we thought, with all the talk of the digital divide and South African overcoming, surely it makes sense to make the spectrum available to extend 5G or even LTE, but preferably 5G into rural areas using the spectrum. So this was actually brought up at the World Radio Congress 2023, a few months ago, and there were mixed results, and I would say they're quite disappointing. Do bear in mind that in many countries in Africa, broadcasting is still a very important, even in South Africa as well, it's still an important medium. So even though I personally don't use linear TV, I use video on demand and choose what I want, there actually are millions of viewers still watching linear TV on a daily basis in South Africa and indeed across Africa. So there is a lot to be said for keeping spectrum for broadcasting. Sort of the reason why I thought there would be progress is because they don't need as much necessarily. I mean, the channels are already there, and we're not seeing many new broadcasters wanting to enter into that space. So it's not a growing demand. So yeah, we saw it as being for the digital divide, but when it came out of World Radio Congress, you'll see that many countries have not supported it in Africa. Some countries do support it, but on a secondary basis, saying if the broadcasters aren't using it, then you can use it. And some countries did actually go ahead, but not in our part of the world. So if we had to do a comparison, we'd say South Africa and Africa were certainly holding back. It had been on the agenda since World Radio Congress 19, so it was discussed beforehand. There was a lot of preparation. And at one stage, we did think it was, well, many of us thought it was a done deal, that it was going to move across. So that's the IMT 600. The one other spectrum I'm going to touch on before moving on is the millimeter wave, or the high frequency. These are the new spectrum bands that have been made available for 5G that weren't available before, and are very much associated with the performance and with that idea of the 3 bands. So you'll see right in 2019, the US actually auctioned some spectrum to give to the operators. The EU identified 3 pioneer bands, including the this high band spectrum, and then they harmonized across Europe so that they could make it available for operators in 2020. South Korea was one of the very first 5G operators to launch, and they made this available to all 3 operators. And this was actually also made available on the handsets. So you'll see the original Samsung's 5G had 28 gigahertz or 26, as you could choose, antenna built into them. Very, very sensitive. If you put your hand in front of it or something, your signal would decrease. But definitely was seen as part of the launch for South Korea. And that partly explains why the original handsets were quite expensive. You'll see now some of the handsets that we're going to talk about later don't have the high frequency at all built into them. So you can get 5G, but you can't get these high speeds. So I've just given you a chart at the top there, which I took from somebody's research, showing the spectrum that's available in the different countries. This was made available from the World Radio Congress 2019. And it goes right from 24.5 at the bottom there, right up to 60 gigahertz. But there's been very little interest up at the top there. It's very high spectrum. It is used for Wi-Fi, this type of level, and the WISPs in South Africa use these for point-to-point or multi-point connections, but not as much for 5G. The interest is mainly around the first band here, the 24 to what they call 24, 26, and 28 gigahertz. But the interest has waned. And I'll mention later that is one of the reasons why private 5G has become more popular, because that gives the customer a choice of whether they want to use it or not. And then just out of interest, Comsol had strong links, their management, with Verizon in America. So you'll see that when they went live with the trial, they actually had access to 28 gigahertz spectrum from a previous assignment, even though it's being used for fixed wireless links. So in 2019, when the people were running trials, they ran a trial using the 28 gigahertz. It's not actually assigned specific. The band planning isn't done for IMT in South Africa, but they were able to use it. The allocation they wanted, and there was a bit of a panic from the other mobile operators. So you'll see Vodacom and MTN also have access to some of that spectrum, the 28. And so they were doing early trials, even in buildings, because they didn't have a license to do 5G inside buildings, and with test trials, and because they thought that this was going to be big. So they needed to be in on the ground floor. So now that's my sort of quick coverage of some of the key aspects of spectrum, and now I'm going to talk about spectrum sharing. So what happens is that I'm going to mention about private 5G and how demand for that and private LTE has taken off. But what's interesting is that in order to have private 5G, you obviously have to use spectrum. You can use unlicensed. It does work if you have the right equipment, but people generally like to use licensed to avoid the interference. And then it has to have been assigned to someone. So it's either assigned to an operator. So in South Africa, all the private 5G projects you see would have been assigned to an operator who then uses their spectrum for your private 5G. Or what's happened in many countries is that spectrum is assigned directly to an industry player or a community, in other words, to the customer. Now, the disadvantage of doing that is you have lower utilization of that spectrum, because the mobile operators tend to use their spectrum, very effectively, because they have efficient planning and high overall demand. If you allocate it to industry and one or two take it up, you have lower utilization. So that's the disadvantage of giving it out to industry directly. The advantage of giving it out is that you then have the customer calling the shots. And that's very key, because we all know how difficult it is to have our own requirements or needs met by a mobile operator who's working in such a mass market environment. Whereas if you have your own spectrum, you can do what you want with it. You can even go to a mobile operator and say, I've got my spectrum, can you provide a managed service? But you have a lot more control. And that's why there's this interest in providing shared or localized spectrum, so that you can create a new type of demand, which is very strongly associated with 5G. But in many ways, it actually sort of, the discussion started with LTE. And that also enables innovation, because people can try things that they wouldn't have normally been able to try. And so a whole innovation hotbed comes out of giving spectrum to the end users rather than to the mobile operators. Now, countries where there are mechanisms, I've listed a few. It's not exhaustive, but the United Kingdom had a very interesting one, which has been closely looked at by South Africa, and that's shared access licensing. So if the mobile operator has the spectrum, but they're not using it in a particular location, there's a mechanism for a third party to use it in that area. The United States actually gave to this cause very useful mid-band spectrum. I've explained how it's important, called CBRS, Citizen Band Broad Radio Service, Citizen Band Radio Services. So that's a very interesting experiment where you can go and apply as a private company for some of that spectrum, but on a localized basis, so the areas where you actually need it. And that already has fostered a lot of innovation, not only from customers, but also from suppliers. And there's some exciting projects that can take place once you have that freedom. Germany has also assigned a particularly useful band, the 37 to 3800. Japan, right in the beginning, assigned the higher band. And then there are quite a few countries which I've listed below. There are many others. There are a couple of others that offer millimeter wave assignments rather than the high demand bands. And then some countries, rather than giving it to the final end user, they said, let's rather make it available to the operators, but provide obligations that they have to provide it when a customer needs it on certain conditions. So that's like Denmark and the Czech Republic. So now the status in South Africa is that ICASA went through a process of consultation. They said what they'd like to do, and they've now made a decision on how they want to provide that spectrum. They looked at two bands, what they called S and C, S being 2 to 4 gigahertz and C being 4 to 8. And they said on the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz, the 4 gig, they want to create that sandbox that I mentioned earlier. They want to have a geolocation database. So each one of your base stations will be geolocated, and you'll get permission to use that on an ongoing basis using this database approach. There'll be primary users who protect it, and then there'll be priority second users. That's mainly the industries, etc., and communities who can purchase short-term exclusive licenses and be protected. So that's the mechanism that they plan to use. Looking at devices, there's a massive choice of devices, and obviously what happens globally impacts South Africa as well positively. So in 2023, the GSM Association of Vendors, GSA, they said there are nearly 2,000 devices simply on the version of 5G called standalone, the new version that's going to go forward. And I've given a breakdown showing that almost half of those are phones, but they're also hotspots, fixed wireless access devices, the purple. These aren't the volumes. This is the number of different options available. And many of these IoT modules are becoming available. So that's just the breakdown of those. And then nowadays, what you're finding is that almost all of the top end of smartphone models, certainly from the top 20 manufacturers, are all automatically 5G enabled. They come like that. And then you see that their handset prices have dropped. So in the early days, they were about $800 in the US, and now we're looking at going under 200 and soon possibly under 99. Two factors have made the pricing come down. They were artificially held up because of COVID, and there were problems with supply, both during COVID and then afterwards with the global supply chain. So the prices stayed a little bit high because of shortages. And then also new phones don't have all the millimeter wave options necessarily, and so they can be cheaper. And you've got quite a few Chinese vendors coming on the market. And I'm talking about not only the handsets, but the actual chipsets that are used. So instead of there being a limited number of chipset providers, specifically Qualcomm being one of the sort of exclusive providers, you now have a couple, some of them concentrating on low-cost chipsets. So in South Africa, certainly you have these much more variety of handsets as well. Many of them just automatically 5G. We don't think that people generally buy a handset because it's 5G. We believe that they generally look at the features like the camera on it and just happens to have 5G. We looked at prices, and they range from about 300, and this is the lower end, 3,600 at the moment. They're two on special for 2,400. So that's just around the just over the $100 mark. You can get a 5G handset, which is a remarkable drop in just a short time. And there's this natural upgrade cycle, and we believe that's the main thing driving the penetration in South Africa, which used to be every 2 years on contract, but it's now moved globally, and therefore we think also in South Africa, and there also many of the contracts are now 3 years. It's more like a 3-year cycle than a 2-year, or it's certainly shifting. And if you think that these handsets started becoming available in 2020, we're not many years into the cycle of upgrades, but it will become more of an issue, more of a sort of driver in the next few years as we get deeper into those replacement cycles. And that will be one of the reasons why 5G expands. Because, well, certainly my experience and many others, you buy a handset, you don't necessarily have to ask for it to be 5G. It comes 5G if it's top end. And then the 5G automatically works on your network. You haven't paid extra or subscribed, as soon as you go into coverage. But we think that lower LSM households are less likely, obviously they're less likely to choose smartphones over their basic feature phones, and they're less likely to specifically want to connect to 5G. So there is going to be more of a higher penetration skewed, as has already happened. Remainingly, it will remain on the higher income cohorts. And fixed wireless access routers are extremely important because most of the actual specific use cases are around fixed wireless access. They were very expensive. Well, initially 5,000 to 10,000 Rand each, and Rain sat with a problem there because they wanted to provide service to customers. This was their service. The device was very expensive. And they wanted to come in at very aggressive pricing in order to sort of make an entry into the market. So they, and now MTN as well, and this follows sort of the ISP market, they have this free-to-use router, where as long as you're providing this, you don't have to take out a specific 2-year contract, but as long as you're using the service, you get a router included in the price, so you don't have this huge upfront cost. But naturally, it's built into the cost somewhere. So as the cost of these devices comes down, we do expect this 5G fixed wireless access market to become more attractive to customers, and therefore it could grow faster. And remember that one of the drivers that Rain had was not only were they wanting to make an impact on the market because they had a head start over the other operators, but they also had congestion on their LTE network that they needed to resolve. So it was in their interest to migrate people to 5G as early as possible. So you're seeing for 595 a month, you can get uncapped on Rain, which includes the router, and similarly with MTN, 500 a month, although that does have a fair use clause built into it. Looking at how this has actually worked out in the market, you'll see that there were a couple of operators who around the world, and in fact countries that went very big, South Korea, China, USA being some examples. And in fact, when you look at the global subscription numbers, you have to bear in mind that because China has been so aggressive with their coverage and promotion in the country, they represent a large portion, often around 40–50% of the total of growth around the world. So they've really influenced it. But South Korea did some early work as well in the US, each operator having a different approach. South Africa started late. MTN and Vodacom didn't have spectrum, but then they got, because of the COVID disaster, so they were able to launch in 2020. So that was probably one of the few positive spin-offs of that period, was that they got access to that spectrum. And they also, one of them made use of spectrum that Liquid Telecom at the time had through a legacy assignment. So that's how they went live. And Rain has grown quite, I wouldn't say aggressively, but sort of their rollout has been quite significant, and the expansion. But MTN does have deep pockets and has claimed to have surpassed them. But they're not using a 3-band approach, as was done in some countries. It's very much a mid-band approach, and they've only recently had access to the low band last year, so been able to now add the low band for coverage. So now 5G, if you look on the left, the color darker blues is almost universal around the world with this gap. In Africa still, if I show you the same map from 2019, 2022 moving, you'll see that Africa has closed the gap, but it's still quite significant. And they're still very early days. Not all the countries have widespread coverage. So really the story in Africa actually is that it's very much a 3G story still, with more than half the subscribers still being in sub-Saharan Africa being on 3G. And I've shown the uptake, and you'll see that 3G right up here, it'll take till 2027 for 4G to overtake 3G. So that's still another 3–4 years before we see 4G dominating. Whereas 5G is still very much coming in at the bottom here. By 2030, when many of the countries in the world will be have very high penetration, sometimes up to 90% of 5G, Africa, sub-Saharan will be sitting on 17. And South Africa, we believe, will be on about 40. That's our projection, 40%. So a lot higher than our neighbors, but not as high. If you look on the left side here, you'll see this graph of the blue is where selected countries like Korea, US, and China, you see the higher ones here. And then a couple of sort of mid ones, Germany, UK, sitting at 20–25%. This is not coverage, but actual subscriber penetration. Going up well over 90 by 2030, this pink red color. And South Africa is sitting here, so around the 40% mark. We agree with the GSMA estimates that's where we will sit. So quite low down compared to a number of countries, but higher than, for example, Nigeria, Philippines, India, Russia. We'll be sitting similar to India and Vietnam. But 4G and 5G coverage are both expanding, and we like to look at them together, because we believe 4G still has such an important role in the country. So Rain has gone into the major areas, also gone into the secondary towns. They have reported that they cover about 7 million households. That seems quite high. That would be about 39% of the households. MTN hasn't reported recently, but when they did report last year, they said they had 25% coverage, and those are the two leading ones, with Vodacom behind that. They last reported 13.5 in 2022. By reported, I mean in the media, because if you look at the ICASA latest state of the industry report that just came out, they cite, based on the feedback they got from the operators, 38.4% coverage, quite specific, by the end of 2023, by end of last year. I personally think that's possibly a little bit higher than it actually is. And then the GSM Association actually cite numbers of 41%, but it's not clear where they get that. They just mention it. We think it's sort of more in the 30s, low 30s. So government policy, just going back to this triangle, remember there were the three elements: mobile broadband, MTC, and ultra reliable. Much of the focus has been around this top category, the enhanced mobile broadband. And if you're looking for let's say, a country like ourselves where digital inclusion and broadband access is important, that's where there needs to be a lot of focus still. So it's a useful block to be in. If you're wanting to create smart cities, etc., then you need to look at this block too, the massive IoT. But we have found that, and we'll show that, we're way behind globally and in South Africa in terms of this deployment. And then these ultra reliable services simply haven't happened yet to any sort of significant level in any countries except really on private 5G networks. So some countries have been proactive, and they've said, look, we need a gigabit society, digital transformation. We need to take steps, and they did it many years ago. So Europe's going into its digital decade with certain speeds, like targeting 100 megabits per second or more, high-speed connections to government buildings, digitalization, skills development in the workforce, and then also maximizing 5G coverage as a specific item. So a whole holistic approach to digital transformation and what they call the gigabit society. They're not worried when they talk about a digital divide. They're not talking about connected or not. They talk about having a high-speed connection or not. And they've set targets, which if you get the presentation, you can have a look at the targets, or you can go to their European sites. China has similar, but this is also very strong on the industry, enabling the industries as well around telecoms. So they call it the digital China strategy. Began many years ago when they promoted fiber to the home extensively. And then after the wave of fiber to the home, they had the wave of 5G. So they've very much focused on getting everyone connected. At the same time, they support a number of industries in order to provide part of the fourth industrial revolution. So that's all seen as part of that, with 5G being central to it. And Singapore is another example where they provide actual gigabit speeds across home, schools, and workplaces. So people are used to having those fast, readily available speeds at affordable prices. Many governments continue to support 5G. I mean, the US realized they were caught napping when some of the Chinese vendors brought out some powerful equipment for 5G. And so they've major plans, some of them using penalties and some using stimulus to try and catch up, because they don't want the whole of Europe, and indeed Europe doesn't want not only to have to buy all the equipment from China, but also to have Chinese equipment running their sort of national communications backbones, private and public. So rightly or wrongly, that's the approach they've taken. Obviously, that hasn't been the case in South Africa, which embraces the government and the operators embrace Chinese vendors, but that's led to major initiatives in the US. And there's this big $9 billion fund for rural 5G expansion. And what these governments are finding is that these investments in infrastructure properly done often leverage private sector spending. So that's quite useful. China not only has provided connectivity, but they also run fairly large trials or encourage the mobile operators to run a wide variety of trials and proof of concepts on all sorts of different use cases, properly spread out so that a whole number of different things are being tested and learnt at any one time across the whole ecosystem. The United Kingdom also has a cross-disciplinary support team to motivate developments around 5G and fourth industrial revolution. Germany realized that they were caught behind on 5G, and so they've gone for private 5G and 6G as topics, but they're spending billions of euros on research to make sure that they stay relevant. And they've assigned spectrum to the industry as part of that. The European Union, I've already mentioned, and South Korea, the whole the government orchestrated with the operators, although it was competitive, their launches and showcased equipment at the last Olympics. And there are many other examples of support. So I said I would provide suggestions as recommendations, but I can leave them into the in the presentation, so we don't go through in line by line, but you'll see that obviously timely assignment of spectrum, coordinating industry, research. Some of these have been picked up by ICASA's latest report on 5G, like the partnerships with academic. You know, there's money could go into supporting academics. SMEs, we did some research and found that SMEs, because they were living hand to mouth and battled to get sort of access to certain research tools, weren't very strong on 5G. And then at the city level, you know, need to promote smart cities and IoT to manage a whole lot of things, especially climate change, fast urban migration, etc. So there's a lot of potential, and I put it all on the slide, and there needs to be agile policy. ICASA is starting to look at the sandboxing, as you saw, which is one of the pillars of agile policy. So that's exciting, and you know, that very much the financial sector in South Africa sort of pioneered the idea of a regulatory sandboxing. Looking at use cases, we've got 4, of which mobile broadband on the handsets, which the GSMA predicts is going to be 40% penetration, as we said. That's the global number if you look at across the world. But there are many drivers of that, depending what handsets available, how much is spent, what services are offered, etc. In South Africa, we've called it a use case, but not really an explicit use case. And that's in line with Europe and the States. They don't have a huge number of actual services that are offered on mobile, whereas in Asia, there's been some ability to monetize additional services using the features of phones. You know, like you can go on a virtual date with a K-pop member or something like that. Cloud gaming, MTN, you know, when they launched 5G, they showcased that, but it's not practical to do it on the network at the moment, especially without the millimeter wave. So the fixed wireless access has really dominated both globally and in South Africa the use case space. And so we think that 5G could account for 58% of the fixed mobile by 2027. So it's growing quite nicely and quite quickly. Private 5G is another area of significant growth for the reasons I mentioned, that you have companies that they want features and they're not getting them from the mobile operators on the public network. And so they go and put in their own, ask for their own private networks. And then you have IoT, which is also a growing area where I'll cover with the slide. So looking at the fixed wireless, you can see the countries which have deployed on the top right. You can see the global connections growing apace. And in this respect, we're very much in line with the world. There are three types of sort of tariff regimes. There's gigabytes that you buy, which is the most common. There's uncapped, which is less common, but is starting to appear. And 5G enables that much more than LTE. And then you have speed-based services. So about 30% of the 5G providers, according to the GSA research, Ericsson actually offer speed-based tariffs. And that's like Rain in South Africa, which uses that mechanism. Then I always show the slide just to show how little of the country is covered with fiber, even though there's a lot of talk about fiber, but as a percentage. So fixed LTE is really where it's at. And I've just given some percentages in the 80 to 100 of fixed LTE, not so much LTE itself, because they pretty much found out during COVID that, that's without the fixed LTE service specifically, you can't really offer true broadband needed from work from home or study from home. And if you look in the country, you'll see that there are stark differences between the urban or the sort of areas and the more remote areas. So there's a lot of potential for fixed LTE, and that is the case. It's about 3 times more coverage and 3 times more subscriber base on fixed LTE than fiber. So that offers a lot of potential for the 5G to expand into that. So these are our projections for fixed wireless, looking at that 58% that I mentioned by 2020. At the moment, we're sitting around 34% of the total 5G being 5G of the total. 34% of all subscriptions from fixed IMT or 5G. The others being fixed LTE. But that number going up all the time. So that's quite an exciting area of potential growth. So that will equate to about 3 million customers. And this number has been revised up for various reasons because of the expansion of 5G as well as the costs of devices coming down and the overall increase in the demand and the fact that you can offer uncapped services being a very attractive driver of service. So we reckon that 5G will be 20% of all the total home base of fixed mobile routers, and that's up from 16%. We reckon that at the end of last year it was 24, up from 16% the year before. So going up fairly sharply. Comsol's introduced a very interesting product on this use case of a business-specific service. Using their 60 megahertz of spectrum. And they've just announced it, and they believe it's highly resilient, with power outages. And this is really a business service. In other words, it's guaranteed quality of service on the throughput, high response rates, etc. So quite a different service from what one can get at the moment from the other operators. So looking at private 5G, you'll see that they're definitely gaining popularity because of the heavy rate of digitalization and the adoption of data-heavy operations in many companies, and the fact that there are concerns about cybersecurity and losing your data, and the cost of deployments coming down. So the rate of announced deployments has gone up quite a lot. You don't know the exact number, just what GSA tracks what's announced. The highest category by frequency is manufacturing, which is actually twice the next category of education, which includes research networks, maybe developing new services. And then you get mining, which is the biggest in South Africa, but this is the second largest if you add oil and gas, but otherwise it's third. And then power utilities. A number of other categories that also feature on the list, smart cities, etc., using private networks, and then many smaller ones like hospitals, etc. Vodacom's put a lot of their focus into the mining sector, a lot of their announcements, with a whole lot of different initiatives being announced. MTN actually said they were the first to deploy a private network in South Africa, also on a mine, together with Huawei. And they now say they provide 14 private networks for 14 companies. So we don't know the number, but we know what they say companies they're working with. And they say deployments on mining and ports, and that they're looking at manufacturing at the moment. And then Comsol's also targeted mining, and they have an arsenal of services because they're used to servicing enterprises already to meet that requirement. So Comsol is interesting because they don't have the big public network, but they've got the spectrum. So they're very much geared and wanting to find a private network to get a return on their investment. Looking at IoT, this is just one slide. You'll see Ericsson's projections that most of the growth will be in the what they call broadband IoT and critical IoT. So I've defined that as including smart wearables, or they have smart meters, industrial automation, but excluding smartphones and TVs, etc. So it's not only the sort of very low bandwidth devices which make up a smaller portion. It's this larger portion where it's actually IoT, but a broadband version of it. South Africa is very slow on the 5G. Remember, they only just started deploying 4G with NB-IoT. So it's been around for a while, but only available commercially, publicly on Vodacom, and now MTN starting to switch on sites on demand. So they have it available, and they, as the requirement builds, they will switch it on. So that's why there's been quite a lot of interest in alternatives like LoRaWAN and Sigfox, because people need these low power networks, and they need a way to get it, but they don't have the coverage benefit that the mobile operators have. Although, of course, the mobile operators always introduce a subscription, whereas if you use an alternative, you don't always have to pay a monthly amount, which can be more affordable. So you'll see a lot of LoRaWAN at farms and also within municipalities. The other reason why 5G hasn't taken off is the high cost of the equipment. So you can't have 5,000 sensors all around your farm or all around your factory because you can't afford them. But you can put equipment, sensors onto expensive equipment, at the moment, where it really makes a huge difference, because then the cost is less significant compared to the benefit. So this is a long and ongoing story that's going to unfold over a longer period than expected. Looking at the road ahead, just to mention that satellite is often spoken about as a backhaul for 5G, not so much in South Africa. But we do believe that with the new low Earth orbits satellites like OneWeb, which has already gone live in South Africa, offering a quality of service background, this could take off. And then the direct to handset could take off. And we see South Africa as, also has access just like any other country. There's not a spectrum issue direct to handset because the satellite will use the operator's spectrum from that country as they go over. And there are trials starting in different countries, but all low bandwidth sort of text messaging type at the moment. So this is a fairly long play. And then we're moving towards, and I'll conclude with this, 5G and 5G advanced. We're moving to, and 6G. 5G is now fully specified. So we've got there 2025, we'll see 5G advanced. It will involve a whole lot of network improvements, the introduction of artificial intelligence and machine learning into the network, and other features like sensing, location sensing built into the network. And that's going to be scoped, finalized quite soon. They talked about between March and June for the various elements. So we do expect to see announcements and even early deployments. Obviously, there's not much that we need in South Africa since we're so low on the curve, except the AI introduction to the network is likely to happen. And we'll probably see some of the sensing features become available on the network, so you can use location very accurately. And then 6G, is supposed to be much more human-centric and look at issues like climate change, try and reduce the impact on the network. So Spectrum has started to be discussed and will be at the next World Radio Congress that's going to be used for 6G. So I started with the initial triangle you see it on the left there. 6G has now got more usage scenarios, so there's 6. So enhancing the current ones and adding like the sensing and the AI, for example, into the use cases. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the capabilities that were on the last wheel that I showed you are going to be enhanced. That's the green at the bottom. And there'll be new ones added, like sensing and location will be one of them, AI, very accurate positioning, 1 to 10 centimeters. So that's where we're looking at the future, and maybe some of these features will be brought forward into 5G even, if they turn out to be popular. The rest, it's not going to make a huge difference to our lives right now because of where we sit, not only in South Africa, but the world. So that's my presentation. Hope it was useful. Thanks, Juanita.
Thanks, Chris. Certainly a lot to take in. There's just a couple of questions I just want to run through. Malicela's asking, it was with reference to the 600 megahertz band. He just asked whether that's the band that is used by ETV.
Well, they're not using. There's one part of the band that's in discussion that is being used by Centec, but it doesn't have to be. It can be migrated out. So it wouldn't impact ETV's future if there was a concerted move to use this.
And then Lyndon asked how much of the 4G, 5G coverage expansion is actually taking place in rural. I think you answered some of that.
No, not nearly enough. That's a huge problem. And now with the sub-gigahertz spectrum, at least the mobile operators are able to do a more affordable rollout in those rural areas, which they've only just started gearing up from last year.
Dion's asking a very interesting question about the impact that Starlink potentially will have once approved for use in SA, if it's ever approved.
Yes, certainly everybody's asking about the impact of Starlink. We find the equipment quite expensive still. If it is approved, it will certainly have its followers and will certainly compete with these. So our numbers sort of assume that there's a level of competition from the low Earth orbiting. We find it more exciting to think, that Starlink could provide backhaul services to some of those rural service providers. But there will obviously be customers that use it, farms, game parks, etc., rural agricultural industries that can afford to spend more and really want that service and don't have any alternative.
Yeah, I suppose, for us, some of the concerns is also that 5G is reliant on fiber. So it's also to get fiber to some of these rural areas, which, of course, the business case for that is very difficult. And I think having looked at and watched your presentation, there's always this whole conversation about, is it going to be fiber or 5G? And I think, this sort of just made that crystal clear that, this is not, they're never going to compete. So there is no competition. And then somebody asked.
So there will be competition to some extent in overlapping areas, yeah. But there can be complementary and competition.
Yeah.
Certainly they'll, if you have a choice and the one's cheaper than the other, you're likely to go for the cheaper one in many cases.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think. Yeah, I agree with you. I think especially some of the price points that some of the products are coming out and being launched now on some of those prepaid services is made for some interesting, R5 a day or 169. I see Sherry says she's got to go. She's got a fall off. Bye, Sherry. Happy birthday. I know that it happens to be Sherry's birthday today. Hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. And then there's one final question saying, will our networks in SA be compatible with 5G broadcasting standards?
broadcasting as in? Maybe they could.
I'm not sure. I don't know. It's an unknown user, so I'm not sure what they mean. Will our
They mean
networks
broadcasting as in the the ability to broadcast MBMS type broadcasting.
using for 5G for broadcast? Using 5G for broadcast.
There are mechanisms to do that, and I'm pretty sure that if there's a business case for it, our networks will be able to do it. I mean, ours are world standard, and they have, leading edge equipment. I know there have been, if it's what I'm thinking about, the MBMS, the operators haven't found a business case for it yet. Yeah.
He clarifies and he says multimedia as in use in the USA. Okay, I think that's it. If there's no other questions, anybody can quickly raise your hand, but otherwise I think we're going to wrap up. Chris, just to say thank you to you and the entire team at BMIT. Thank you for always coming on board. Thanks for your support of the organization. One final question is, will this presentation be available to be shared or is it proprietary? If somebody can reach out to you and contact you if they would like to have access to it.
Yes, absolutely. We did commit to make it available. So I'll just check through. If I don't think I find any typos, then I'll make it available.
Okay, great stuff.
Yeah,
I will ask my team, Risha and Sipho, if you can make it available. And then with your blessing, we'll always publish this online with a link to this entire recording so people can watch it or share it with their team internally. And I know that if somebody would like to reach out to you on a one-on-one level to engage with them or their team, that you will be available for that engagement as well. But otherwise, yeah, the only thing that is left for me to say is I wish everybody a really wonderful weekend. Good luck with the rest of this Friday. And yeah, I think we've got a webinar in another couple of weeks looking more at competition law. And then we know that there's another webinar coming up, I think in June, looking at the monetization of fiber to the home networks, how that has changed. That whole market is looking very different to where we started 14 years ago, what we thought it would look like. And we're very grateful that we're going to have a financial guru that's going to come and talk to us about how we need to relook the monetization of FTTH networks. But otherwise, great to have you all online. I wish I could come and sit and have coffee with every single one of you. I see so many names coming in the side and running through the side, and I just think like there's like a million people I haven't seen for so long, and I wish I could sit down and just catch up with all of you. But it's really great to see you all online, and I wish you a wonderful weekend. And yeah, as Colin was saying, happy Mother's Day to all the moms, all the women, whether you're a real mom or whether you just are a mother to other people and other ladies and other women. Wish you a wonderful Sunday. Have a great weekend, and we'll be in touch. Cheers, everyone.